The Ex-Worker,
An audio strike against a monotone world.
a podcast of anarchist ideas and action.
For everyone who dreams of a life off the clock. Welcome back to The Ex-Worker. In this episode, we're taking an in-depth look at one of the major success stories of 2017. The blockade in Olympia, Washington, that stopped a train carrying fracking supplies for 12 days, making it the second longest train blockade in U.S. history.
People went hard in early 2017 during the inauguration and the airport shutdowns, but most of the year felt like we weren't gaining momentum. That's all the more reason why this action was so inspiring. It renewed hope and forged new relationships at a time when many weren't expecting that.
But nothing ever happens in a vacuum. We'll take a closer look at what made this action a success, what it looked and felt like on the ground, and what lessons we can learn from it. But first, let's take a look at what led to this blockade. For more resources and information on the ideas we talk about today, check out our show notes for links.
Olympia, Washington has a long history of environmental activism, with a focus on fracking since 2013, when the port of Olympia began to ship fracking equipment as cargo. That year saw many protests at the port, some of which included anarchists and others forming a soft blockade of human bodies in front of logging trucks, and generally trying to hinder port operations as much as possible. These smaller actions eventually lost momentum, though. In the summer of 2016, the Port of Olympia opened negotiations with the U.S. military to start shipping military cargo through the port again. This galvanized new resistance, with anarchists and other activists forming a port militarization resistance network, similar to one that had existed a decade before. The port eventually backed down from the contract, perhaps because of the resistance already mounted against it, but the new relationships built through organizing against it stayed strong. More and more people started paying attention to the port, and people began to gather information that helped them track shipments of ceramic proppants.
Manufactured by Rainbow Ceramics and shipped by war profiteers Halliburton, who have ties to the Bush family and former Vice President Dick Cheney, these proppants were small ceramic balls used during fracking to prop up wells and prevent collapse when the natural gas is removed. They don't always work as promised, as evidenced by the frequent earthquakes and other disasters that accompany natural gas extraction. The proppants moving through the Port of Olympia travel on ships from China, and then trains that leave from the port and head south to the Columbia Gorge, then east towards the fracking wells of North Dakota, and more recently, Wyoming. It was right below the point where two train tracks merge, one leading from the Pepsi bottling plant, the other from the Port of Olympia, that people built the first train blockade in 2016.
In November of 2016, at the height of the months-long struggle on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, people who had been steadily tracking the schedules of proppant shipments gathered to disrupt their delivery to the fracking wells. While the shipments had been moving through the Port of Olympia for a few years, it may have taken the actions at Standing Rock to galvanize a larger number of people to react with means that could actually have an effect on the shipments. Between November 11th and 18th, some of these rebels set up a blockade on the rail line leading out of the port. This week-long blockade led Halliburton, the corporation responsible for shipping the proppants, to declare that they would never do business with the Port of Olympia again. This blockade was ultimately attacked and cleared by the Olympia Police Department in the middle of the night. At the time, the Olympia Chief of Police declared that he had sympathy for the blockaders' cause and didn't want to do his job. His actions showed that his feelings didn't matter as much as the flow of commerce and the role that extractive industries play in it. Ultimately, those proppants made their way to the Dakotas just as the Dakota Access Pipeline was fully constructed, despite massive opposition by members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and their supporters.
Fast forward to November 2017. Word spread once again that a shipment of proppants was scheduled to move through the Port of Olympia. So in the wee hours of November 17th, folks braved the wet Pacific Northwest night to set up a blockade at the same site as last year, just below the junction of two tracks, several blocks from the entrance of the port.
Though disrupting fracking was a primary goal for many of these folks, not all blockaders had the same concerns, and fracking wasn't the only target. When the port of Olympia tried to garner sympathy by claiming they had no plans to ship proppants, but rather that the blockade had halted a train carrying high-fructose corn syrup to the Pepsi bottling plant, many felt this was icing on the cake. Not all blockaders had a unified sense of purpose, message, or tactics either. While plenty of folks went to meetings with the port and city council to try to convince them to change their behavior, others chose to let the blockade speak for itself, refusing to negotiate with the authorities in any way. While the port tried to deny what was being shipped through its gates, others scouted out and documented firsthand what was in the port, noting the bags of proppants clearly marked with the name of their manufacturer, and the Halliburton railcars clearly marked with their call sign, HWCX.
The blockade itself was built from pallets scavenged from capitalism's detritus. Barrel fires, tires, hay bales, and other objects that continued to grow as the days passed. Countless passionate souls spent innumerable hours maintaining this encampment and making sure the port's cargo couldn't make it through. Over the course of 12 days, these rebels would share meals, hold meetings, organize movie nights, lead skill shares, play music, write communiques, eat and sleep together, and disrupt the flow of commerce, if only for a little while.
12 days after this blockade began, the camp was raided by the Olympia Police Department, backed up by Union Pacific's railroad police, armed with riot gear and armored vehicles. But nobody was there. The rebels had vanished into the night, evading the police in favor of fighting another day.
We don't claim many easy victories in revolutionary struggle. We're usually painfully aware of what we haven't won, what we still need to change. By most standards, though, this blockade was a big win. The blockade cost the city, the port, and corporations a large amount of money, while losing us nothing except the garbage left behind at the camp. There were no arrests, no bail money or legal fees needed, no time lost to jail support or court solidarity. Even more surprising, the Olympia blockade saw the beginning of new relationships of solidarity between people who ordinarily wouldn't have found much common ground. We were able to talk to some of these comrades on the ground, and the stories we share with you today are from a handful of people who helped make this extraordinary space possible.
On the last day of camp, the blockade in downtown Olympia had grown into a temporary autonomous zone. Seen from the hill above, its network of colorful tarps looked like a city in miniature, with the edges surrounded by pallets and plywood and other objects that seemed about ready to become something new the moment you looked away. Even on the last night, blockaders were making plans for expansion. The entrance to camp at that point was surrounded by a circle of hay bales and enclosed with pallets and one giant circus tent that stretched 20 by 60 feet. Its tarp had been branded by Red Bull but was quickly beautified and profaned with other messages. A black flag flew above the many intersecting tarps and tents and open spaces, including the open square where a 55-gallon barrel held a fire where blockaders could warm themselves at any time, day or night. The sprawling hive of tarp structures had walls made of pallets and metal road signs, and held couches where people often slept. A kitchen area always had pastries and often hot food, as well as carafes full of hot coffee and herbal tea that supporters regularly refilled. Smaller structures, built of PVC pipes and tarps, became designated for specific purposes. One was a free school and quiet study area. Another became a safer space for women, trans, and femmes to meet, sleep, and socialize. A medical cabinet included first aid supplies, tinctures, and fire cider. One wall of this was itself a barricade, made of an impressive array of junk that stretched onto the tracks leading toward the port, including, amongst other things, a piano. And at the entrance of the blockade, a banner stretched, reading, "This is Squaxin Nisqually Land." Within this liberated space, which grew more ambitious and stranger each day, countless people came together to create a different kind of world.
The first question we asked blockaders was how this happened. What made this year's blockade different from last year?
A bunch of people showed up Friday, November 17th, with one huge banner and a bunch of other signs. There's probably like 20, 30 people there. There were a few pallets just randomly thrown over the tracks. The cops showed up, messed around. Maybe they said something, or I don't know. And then overnight, a barricade and an encampment was set up about the same size as last year's. And immediately donations started flooding in, especially in context of 2016. The community, I think, already knew what to expect a little bit, like, oh, they're doing another encampment. Remember what happened last time? So immediately all the people who had supported last time, I think, came down, and tables and pop-ups and cooking gear and extra food all started showing up. Pallets started showing up in mass. So many couches and mattresses, we didn't know what to do with them for a while. And eventually we were more, when people are asking, what can we do? We were more asking them for free hands than for more stuff, because we had so much stuff. We physically shut down the port of Olympia, so fracking proppants weren't able to move, and also a local Pepsi bottling plant wasn't able to bottle their Pepsi, which is totally fine in my book.
This could be seen from the outside as just like doing something again and kind of making it this like symbolic annual thing, but I think that this year is like built a lot upon what happened last year, and like even though it was obviously the same tactic of blocking a train and the same type of train, I like see it as an escalation of what the blockade was last year, and of having learned a lot from the blockade last year, and that's like really exciting. It wasn't just the same thing twice. Last year the train was stopped with like essentially a demonstration with people, and then no one actually planned for there to be a barricade or like blockade that people would stay set up. People just didn't want to leave, and it happened organically, and that was really beautiful. But it also meant that like it was like 24 hours before people were like, whoa, I guess we're not going anywhere, like we should build a tent and stuff like that. And this year, like after the barricade had been up 12 hours, it was already as strong as it was on the 7th day last year. And there was like never any stagnation. People like from the moment the train was stopped all the way to the night, even when people like thought the cops were going to come in a couple hours, people were continuing to like build and expand to make more space for people to like sleep in and live in, and also to like make the barricades on the tracks like stronger, more complicated, harder to see, which would make the raid more complicated, harder to take apart. Yeah, it was bigger and better and longer than last year, for sure. And that was really exciting.
I think there were two major lessons and several minor lessons that informed this year. One of them was a willingness to immediately begin expanding and growing the occupation, and to assume that we were going to be around for a while. Last year there was a lot of hesitancy. People thought we were going to get raided right away and weren't willing to commit resources. And this year we just decided to turn it into something really big and beautiful as quickly as possible, which in turn affected the ability of the space to hold people comfortably. And I think the second was a more strategic orientation towards the police. So a combination of tracking their movements, of trying explicitly to avoid symbolic arrests, and in creating a lot of opaque space with the use of tarps and different chambers and different corridors, which made it difficult for them to surveil us and to accurately judge our numbers. I think those things are responsible in large part for how long and how successful this occupation was, and for us getting out at the end with 0 arrests, no drawn-out court cases, and no bail money drain, which means ending strong instead of burning out. I think there's a lot more energy now than there was after the end of last year's blockade. I think last year felt really inflected by the presidential election. There was a lot of tumult across the country, and it also felt really inflected by the level of struggle at Standing Rock. While this year, things, especially in this corner of the country, felt kind of at a low level of struggle, and I felt pretty excited that we were able to pull this off. I think it's possible anywhere. I think we're seeing these types of activities happen more and more, especially related to oil extraction and oil transportation industries. But, we've been seeing people using the strategy of blockades and occupations targeted towards logistics and infrastructure of capital a lot in the last 10 years, and I think we'll see more of that. So I think there's a couple of things that felt really unique to Olympia in this occupation. One of that is just the history of blockading the port. So back in 2006, 2007, 2008, people were blockading military equipment being shipped through the port of Olympia. I actually was around in 2007 for some of those struggles. And I think that history and the victories we won back then kind of affected the imagination in the present. I mean, it meant that people knew it was possible. We put it on the table. I'll also say that this shit was way cooler and way more effective and way longer lasting than anything that got pulled off 10 years ago. So that's pretty awesome. I think another thing that felt unique to Olympia was the good relations and the level of connections between houseless folks who are participating in the blockade. And I think there's a big street community in Olympia, and there's a lot of crossover in the radical community here between those two milieus. And I think that allowed people to take a more nuanced and productive approach than I saw in things like Occupy, where there was a lot of conflict between the so-called political people and the houseless people who would show up. And that felt present here, but much more nuanced and complicated and much more productive. Yeah, I think the main thing I want people to know in other places about it is that it's entirely possible to pull it off. And that the more you assume success from the start, the more interesting and lively it'll be instead of planning for failure.
We were on public property and we were on railroad property. And so there is that kind of this chain of command that has to happen, where the railroad has to ask for the state sheriff's assistance, and then the sheriffs have to ask the local Olympia Police Department for assistance. And they actually, ironically enough, they call these agreements mutual aid. What we found out last year is that we put ourselves in this jurisdictional no man's land, being like on the tracks, but also on public property, and our Olympia Police Department basically just didn't want to touch it. And I think that might be because of the history of the fierce resistance that has always been put up to the police here in Olympia. Not always, but quite a bit. There was a lot of people talking in year one about where did all the skills that people supposedly learned during Occupy, where did those go? It felt like that there was a really big gap in knowledge and skills in the crews and in the people who showed up. And that was definitely not a topic of discussion this year. It was very clear from day one that the people had the skills, had the knowledge, and had the vision of what we were doing. At the port meeting, I mean, there was a very impassioned, gray-haired, liberals and other kind of folks who were saying you need to take these people seriously, what they're doing is right. And so we do have a swath of support from outside of our normal political channels as far as when it comes to the stopping of shipping of fracking sands.
So the blockade started on a Friday, and then when we got to the next Friday, because trains normally leave the port on Tuesdays and Fridays at 2 or 3 in the morning, I was like, they're definitely going to come. Friday's the day that the train normally goes by. It'll be the week mark. They can't let it last longer than a week. I really was in that mindset. And at 4:17, which is the time we got the dispersal order last year, people put on music really loud, and everyone cracked a beer, and we counted down from 10, and it was a huge celebration of making it longer than the year before. just felt incredible. It was like everyone was like so happy. And also that celebration was happening in the street in the front of the blockade, like in the intersection. So this year's blockade lasted 12 days, which was much longer than last year's, which was raided on the 7th day. And on Wednesday morning, it was raided by a combination of Olympia police, state police, county police, and rail police. There was no arrests, and they came at about 5. When the police arrived, everyone who was in camp left, which is a difference from last year and was what allowed it to happen without any arrests, which I think is a really positive thing because the arrests from last year's blockade, their court proceedings just got finalized and they got a plea 2 weeks ago. So they were like in court and dealing with that for an entire year, which is a huge strain on people's like time and money and ability to do other things.
So there was a coordinated effort to alert people before the raid.
Mm-hmm. Last year, people were alerted before the raid. People knew that the police were coming. They were tipped off by an employee somewhere downtown and then also saw police like amassing in riot gear. However, last year, many people were less sure how the police would act and made the decision not to disperse when the police came and to stay and to see how long they could keep the camp. And I think that was a decision that made sense for that time, and people hadn't discussed other options. But this year, yeah, people were trying to do it with at least no purposeful arrests. Police will do what they're going to do, but no arrest that's like you doing something that is like 100% you're definitely going to get arrested. The morning the raid came, there was a little bit of notice, although less than last year, because police actually staged somewhere else and came off of the freeway, like already with their lights on. So they were able to surround the camp really quickly. Last year they staged by the Capitol, so people just saw them like putting on their riot gear like a long time before they came. But there was some inkling that they were coming from various sources, and it was so people thought that might happen, but it was less confirmed and there was less time period of like actually seeing them getting ready. But people were able to all make it out of the camp by the time the police got there. There's like really funny videos of them. You like can't see into the blockade the way it was set up. And so they like issued 4 dispersal orders to an empty camp and then brought a SWAT team to go and clear every single tent because they seemed really, really afraid that there was like no one coming out and thinking that people were in there still.
I was shocked at the amount of police that came to evict the camp. I mean, with the MRAP that was there, with the and up in the sky there was like 3 or possibly 4 different like airplanes, helicopters, things like that. Now, like one of them was actually a news helicopter, which later I went and looked at footage of.
They were certainly prepared to raid the camp when they raided it, although it took them 10 days to get organized for it. But we were also prepared for that raid. We had preempted it. We had scouts, and people were able to leave the camp. And meant they spent a huge amount of money and time and energy on a big operation, which cost us mostly some garbage that we left in camp. I think that we certainly pushed things further this year and learned that lesson from last year, and that was super important. And the other thing that I want to say is that an eviction or an end of the blockade isn't necessarily a failure. I think it's a piece of information that lets us judge our capacity accurately. The police are always going to raid us at some point. They're always going to stop what we're doing. In a certain sense, they're a hard limit that we're going to push up against. So it's not a failure when we lose to them. It's just a way for us to judge our capacity. It means that next time, if we want this to last, we need more support, we need more materials, more resources, and more capacity to defend ourselves and to keep living together.
Everyone we interviewed stressed one thing in particular about the camp.
That it was fun. And I feel like people think that's like a silly thing, but I think that a lot of people who are interested in taking some sort of direct action and are angry about fossil fuels or just about like the entire world can see things and think that they are like difficult and grueling and something that is not something they can do. And of course, there's nights where like you're standing in the cold rain from like 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., like drinking coffee. That's not easy. But also, I like really want to convey to people that that never felt like work. That always felt like something that I was not just okay with doing, but like happy to be doing and gave me joy and energy. People talk about burnout and like that can be a real thing, but also thinking about like what we think makes us tired is not what actually makes us tired. It's like the whole rest of the world that makes us really tired. In moments where we can resist that together, whether it's for 20 minutes in a riot or for like 12 days in a blockade or for like hopefully much longer than that, that is like fun and energizing and like not something, it's not like the struggle in the negative sense that people might think it is.
I mean, the camp, the actual, just the physical infrastructure of the camp this year was 3 times as big as the infrastructure last year. You know, we actually, during all of this, we found some notes that were taken from last year's kind of like debrief and what the types of things that we wanted to do. And basically every single thing that was listed, well, not every single thing, but a lot of things that were listed happened this year. Last year we listed that we wanted to do workshops. This year we did workshops. Last year we listed that we wanted to have music. This year we had 3 concerts. We had 2 kind of like folky concerts and then 1 like all night punk show. You know, we had a Skillshare day, had like a much more fortified barricades. We had a lookout post that was like positioned like out back of the camp. And it's always just really incredible because a lot of times, you know, these types of occupations, at least in the US, are more, you know, like rural occupations of like logging roads and stuff like that. And I think it's really powerful to see this kind of like this rip open of occupation in the middle of the city, you know, and that was like really like, you know, that's just in and of itself is really inspiring. And just the fact that we're creating the space that we want to see in the middle of the shit.
And I think people have just gotten to the point where they understand the realities of structural violence, and the realities that actions that include maybe a stop to capitalism and economic trade and a potential like destruction of property in response to structural violence isn't the same thing and isn't violence. Yeah. And so I didn't really see anybody needing to have that discussion this time around, which was refreshing.
Yeah, I think that like multiplicity of relations was opened, and like that's part of what makes it so exciting is like and not to say that there like weren't problems and that it wasn't like difficult, but for 12 days I like really think that we got to like experience a life that's like worth living. That was incredible. And there was like, I feel like an incredible opening of relations made possible by that space in a lot of different ways. One of which being that by making the barricade that necessitated people being there all the time, which necessitated making like dry, warm sleeping space, you automatically have created a space that has like been needed by so many and is needed by so many in town, and like 10 to 20 unhoused people had like a drier and warmer and more comfortable place to sleep every single night while the blockade was happening, which was like incredible. And then also created, I think, a lot of relationships that wouldn't have been forged otherwise, because it's often difficult to make connections between housed and unhoused people, and also a lot of the ways that that's often gone about can be like really condescending.
What do I most want people to know? That it was and is a movement for everyone, that we want people to get involved, that it's kid friendly, that we had a kid space, we had paint going on, we had people hanging out all day. And so I was really, really happy with the tone of like friendliness and community and family. Like I really felt at home down at the barricade more than I do in my own house. I think a lot of people share that sentiment as well. And that made me super proud.
You know, the buildings nearby slowly got covered with more and more beautiful graffiti. It felt like this funny, weird, safe zone that people could go into and come out dressed as a different person and commit whatever things they wanted to do and then return to camp. Felt like a little home base in an interesting way. And I think it was a really interesting example of a successful diversity of tactics in a really true way, in that people were, you know, doing whatever they were doing to the train tracks. People were cooking food. People were tagging buildings with anti-fracking, anti-capitalist graffiti. People were talking to interlopers and talking to passersby. All these different things were going on. No one was trying to hamper most of those things. So it felt like a really interesting and productive combination of clandestine and public disobedience. Lots of people were going in and out pretty casually. Certainly, many people didn't cover their faces in camp, but it was also pretty normal for people to walk around fully masked up.
We also opened up a space for houseless people to stay in, which is a huge part of this blockade. It wasn't only about fossil fuel extraction. It was also about creating autonomous community. And I think we opened up a space for the community at large in this area to start having bigger discussions.
What did you personally find most inspiring?
I would say like how joyous it was. I feel like it's one of the few places and like actions that I've been a part of that no matter what frustrations there were, I didn't lose sight of like the joy in it. And I think that a lot of people did a good job of like fostering that, and that was like incredibly beautiful. And I think that that's related to it always expanding and people experimenting and not letting it stay stagnant. Because like there was a point where like there was a very strong barricade on the tracks, and there's not necessarily a need to keep building, but like people chose to be like, okay, what would it look like if we closed the intersection with like hay bales so that we could have like games and play shows, and like that type of experimentation helped like foster this sense of joy and like a constantly like changing and like reigniting joy. So I wasn't just like last night like more of my friends were here than tonight, like this sucks. I was like, oh my god, there's like a huge like new structure that has some weird new activity going on in it that wasn't here yesterday.
We were also curious about what led to the action's success, and if there was something particular about Olympia and this current moment that made this possible, or if blockades like this could proliferate.
I think this action is incredibly repeatable and should be like repeated everywhere as soon as possible. The like very crude first barricade on the tracks, it was by just a group of people with like a reinforced banner. Nothing had been set up as far as a barricade or a camp yet because they weren't sure what time the train would leave. And then 2 blocks down, the first barricade was set up by like 5 people in like 20 minutes. And like it wasn't like the big beautiful barricade that it was like 12 hours later, but it was like a thing that had to be moved before a train could pass. That's like such a simple thing to do. In other places, like the response from the state might be different. The construction of a barricade and barricading like infrastructure, fossil fuel or otherwise, is like extremely repeatable. I think that people like look at pictures of like the camp on day 10 that are like taken from far away, and it's like this sprawl of like tarps and mess, and you're like, they've been there like 10 days. Like it seems kind of like this big thing, and it feels like this big thing in some ways, but I think it's like important to remember like there was a barricade up in 20 minutes. Like anyone can do that at any time, and I don't think that there's anything about that that is unique to this place or this situation in any way. And that can be done with a very small group of people.
The question is also if you're able to outgrow the ability of your local police department to respond very quickly, then you're good for at least like a certain amount of time until they're able to rally the support to get all of their police departments there. Because with the Olympia Police Department, they had to call in police officers from the surrounding areas to take all of their normal calls while they were responding to the eviction of the blockade. And so there's a lot of different bureaucratic mechanisms that have to go into place, and a lot of agreements that have to go into place if an eviction is able to outgrow the local police department's ability to respond. That's a possible repeatable part of this action. So now, as far as I can tell with the research that I've done, the second and the third longest blockade of the railroads in the United States history has happened here in Olympia. The longest was an indigenous blockade about mining shipments that essentially, they won. And the similar thing about that blockade and the Olympia blockade was the fact that there was like these bureaucratic mechanisms that basically didn't want to touch it, because in this indigenous blockade, essentially the state ruled it a treaty issue and put it into a federal jurisdiction, and the feds basically couldn't figure out what to do with it, and so eventually they got like an EPA research team or whatever on the ground to check out the feasibility of what was going on at this mining site. Long story short, they won. The mine was shut down, and they took down their blockade. It's always good to really do your research and find out exactly what the jurisdiction, no man's land, is in the state, because, right, the state's ultimate tool is their appearance of omnipresence and of solidity, that they're solid, but they're not, and they have all these gaps, and it's not like a monolithic, while we talk about it and think about it in like and it's a very useful tool to think about it and talk about it in like a monolithic fashion. The fact that it is not, and that there's all these like different parties within it, and that while we want to smash all of them, we can cause them to fight each other sometimes, and to figure out how we can more effectively agitate those areas is something that's always worthwhile thinking about. And then always finding like the gaps where it's exploitable, and perhaps there can be more experimentation with seeing if other blockades in other places find the same jurisdictional gap, essentially, with like local police departments not wanting to mess with protesters that are on rail police's land. And the first year, something that's really important to think about is that there was when the blockade got set up the first year, there was a giant anti-Trump marching around Olympia, and as well as a pro-Planned Parenthood protest going on. And so if there are knowingly going to be other, let's say like really large scale actions happening, those are where the police are going to be tied up. Those are also possibly exploitable places in which people could take those actions.
The emergency that we are responding to is like always happening. There will always be other people doing similar things, and also other like horrific, terrible things happening that you can reach out to like other people resisting, like no matter when you're doing something. But it's important to like understand that that's true all the time, and that's not like something to wait for. I also feel like there's like a lot of talk about like sort of our current like moment and political climate, and like there's like things that are unique about every time, but I think it's like important not to get into a space of like acting like we need to wait for specific crises or specific like inspiring moments to like do something, because both of those things are always there.
You can't drink oil. Keep it in the soil. You can't drink oil. Keep it in the soil. You can't drink oil. Keep it in the soil. You can't drink oil.
You're listening to the
X Worker.
An audio strike
against a monotone world.
Although it seems like the radical communities in Olympia learned a lot since the 2016 blockade, we're not talking about one cohesive affinity group. Rather, the encampment included a spontaneous and chaotic range of people at any given moment, many of whom had never organized together and had their fair share of differences. That's one of the most fascinating things about this story. One of the most effective actions of recent years happened despite the people participating in it not always feeling that they were on the same page. Many might be familiar with this dynamic from the Occupy movement or other encampments.
As a tactic, public occupation will always bring up the same issues. Which groups and identities belong inside the liberated space and which don't? How do we protect ourselves from oppressive speech and behavior within the space? How do we reconcile different desires for greater autonomy or greater unity? How do we transform social relations between those who have more or less social power, whether that falls along lines of race, gender, income, health, or any other division?
These are all big questions, and none of them have easy answers. But we can take a look at the ways they crop up in actions like this to begin to solve the core problems that block us from doing more together.
So we asked some blockaders about the tensions and disagreements in the camp. It felt important to include this, not to shit talk or take away from the success of this moment, but to be real about how messy occupations can be. They are spaces where people come together for diverse reasons and from diverse backgrounds. The challenge and the joy of these temporary autonomous zones is learning how to get along and become powerful with people who don't share all of your political analysis.
We don't want to belabor the tensions that arose, but an honest look at social dynamics can teach us how to be better prepared next time. Some of the core tensions at the Olympia blockade arose because of fundamental differences around the idea of organization versus autonomy.
Because there were many different positions and strategies, and that sometimes collided with each other. And I think that if we had, as a group, decided on common ground, it could have streamlined a lot of the discussion and therefore the action within the encampment. There was a lot of colliding tendencies between people that could have been smoothed, I think, by common agreements, which I know everybody shares in those spaces. I think that obviously the main thing that people think of when they think about the Olympia blockade is that we're blocking fracking sands and therefore fossil fuel industry. And so some people seem to think that just by being there, it was enough and that we didn't need to focus on any further momentum or outside issues, that just blocking that one train spoke for itself, which is very true in a sense. But it's also true that stopping one train for 12 days is a very small part of the problem, and that the Port of Olympia is going to continue to ship fracking sands and other problematic freight. And so the greater issue is getting the Port of Olympia to stop doing that. And by doing that, we need to pressure them in various different ways and potentially regain control as a community over that port and wrest it from the corporations. And that can't be done by having a demandless, unidentifiable autonomous movement. Also in terms of media, and we have our own media, it's really important, I think, to get out a streamlined message and build people. Because I think the greater public, a lot of times, do want to support these movements and these actions, and it's hard for people who don't know what's going on to support something that they don't understand. I think that having a solid coalition that's somewhat above ground with their message and the reason that they're in solidarity with each other, like, again, points of unity, is really important. But then, like, people protecting their individual identities and taking autonomous actions within that framework is really important as well.
Yeah, so there was certainly disagreement within the camp, especially over demands and whether we have them or whether we don't. It felt a lot less divisive than last year. Last year felt somewhat dominated by a professional activist milieu, and this year felt much more heterogeneous. Some people felt really strongly about establishing very clear demands and felt strongly that we needed to present a unified front to the public. And other people felt that any form of unified demands opened the door to recuperation. This issue wasn't resolved, so as a result, there were no formal demands issued from the group. That said, some lists of demands did come up, and I think it's interesting to think about how those function. One group put out a list of intentionally absurdist demands, including things like, make the port a beach again, blow up the sun, and make the city manager Steve Hall fight a bear, and so on. and another group put out a list of fairly typical activist demands, green energy, horizontal management of the port, and so on. This tension often felt elevated at General Assemblies between a few people who felt passionate about it, but I think most people, most of the time, didn't actually care that much about the debate and were much more interested in the immediate possibilities of the space. I, for one, was much more interested in what we could do in the moment with what we had than in what our ideological sock puppets were. I think that those people who are strongly opposed to demands have a really good reason to be wary of issuing demands to authority figures. I think they're familiar with the way that recuperation has functioned throughout history, and I agree with them that I want to be as opaque as possible to the police and bureaucrats and our enemies. That said, I also want to find ways to be transparent to other people who might join us, and I think we run the risk of being so opaque as to be irrelevant to anyone. So communes, like revolutions, have to grow or die, and I'm interested in the ways that we can grow our relations with other people who are maybe quote-unquote non-political, who might also feel interested in what we're doing. But it might be interesting to try to sidestep the question of demands altogether and start instead articulating what we're doing. We're blockading the trains, we're stopping fracking, we're providing food and sleeping space for anyone who wants it, we're trying to live in a different rhythm of life. All of these things and communicating those things are maybe more interesting than arguing about what demands we're issuing, since those demands will never be granted regardless. It might just be a different way to engage with the nebulous public that gets really fetishized oftentimes.
The same people who are pushing back against demands were pushing back against like organization, were pushing back against the media team. And while like a media team can be problematic, it's also possible, to have a media team that's just dedicated to like getting people who are going to release media like separate from each other together to talk, and then not saying that they necessarily have to like agree or like have to agree not to release media or whatever. There was a lot of different media being released from a lot of different kind of like teams within the blockade. There was people who were releasing media that, in my opinion, was more about stuff that needed to be talked about within the camp and people needed to like sit down and have conversations about, and like was more about internal dynamics of the camp and not so much like a media release, like, to the world. And I thought it was a little passive aggressive that like some of the stuff got released. So, but we're trying to address that now. We're trying to sit down and have those talks. And yeah, that's my hope. I don't necessarily feel like it's as important to have a unified voice from a blockade, but I do believe that it's important for the people within the blockade to be in more communication with each other than they are with the world outside of the blockade. And that's one thing that we definitely could have done a lot better.
There was a lot of space of like solidarity open between like groups of people that often disagree with each other, and like there was of course always arguments between like tendencies or like people who have different visions or whatever, but I think that especially this year compared to last year, like those arguments were conducted with a lot of like care and respect. Was really exciting and also kind of unexpected to me, because like those arguments can be like so emotional. Yeah, there's like something about living together even for 12 days when it's like in that intense type of circumstance and doing something that people care about really deeply, that like bonds people, and that bond can create a lot of opportunities for like working together in the future that would not normally be there. They were handled with more care than I expected, which does not necessarily mean that like people are also terrible to each other when they disagree. That's something that's always there. But I think people were thinking through that a lot and like realizing that happened and trying to be more careful with those dynamics. I think that there's a lot of division there because some people feel that no demand should be made, or there should be no attempt to appeal to authority for what we want. And I think especially when you're in the position of a blockade where it's like we are enacting what we desire, it can feel to me like it takes away from that to try to then like appeal to power to like stop the train when we already stopped the train. And that can feel really frustrating. Yeah, other people in camp definitely feel like by stopping the train, we are like given this power and we should use that to demand things of like local authorities. That's like the main point of contention and disagreement that's actually specific to the blockade. But then a lot of that can spiral into the larger disagreements of just like what people want the world to be like. That can be frustrating sometimes. One thing that was good is like from the beginning of the blockade, it was agreed upon that there were nightly meetings or whatever, but that the General Assembly, like the people at the nightly meetings, like is not a decision-making body, and there is no decision-making body. There are certain like tendencies that would see the GA as a place to make decisions, to vote on things. The agreement that it was not that, and that doesn't exist as like a starting point, I think was really good and made it so that people could do things and voice different messages. But for the most part, people were very clear that that did not speak for everyone, because I think that when those disagreements become really upsetting is when I feel like my action and investment in this project is being like used as a pawn in someone's legislative agenda, that that's being spoken for me. But I think for the most part that didn't happen, and like people were able to speak for themselves from like a variety of angles, and not having points of unity or like anything that is presented as agreed upon by the whole group, because those things are never actually agreed upon by the whole group, and not having any body that is said by some to be endowed with decision-making power were really helpful, in my opinion, for that going more smoothly.
Long-lasting seizures of public space, occupations and blockades and encampments and things like that. There's certain issues that are just always going to come up. One of those is questions of safe or safer spaces, or what to do with oppressive behavior when it's not just a subculture there, but is open to all kinds of people. Another question and conflict that also comes up is over who belongs there. And I saw this play out a few times in camp, just arguments over whether quote-unquote apolitical houseless people should be there or not. Most people there, and myself included, tend to reject the question or the concept of apolitical. And I'm personally more interested in having a space that's like really radically open, as long as people aren't being fucked up. But also, fucked up things happen, and we need to deal with those things and to find ways to preempt them as much as possible. We've gotten good in the past several years in this country at looking at infrastructure and logistics, particularly of capital and of extractive industries, as points of intervention. So blocking ports, blocking railroads, blocking pipelines, blocking highways, these are things that tend to happen a lot nowadays. And that's great. But there's a lot of other things that are much more difficult to grasp tangibly that we're also much worse at shutting down. Patriarchy, white supremacy, all of the really fucked up varieties of oppression that fall along axes of identity. In a certain way, those are a lot harder to see and to stop than a train or than a line of police. We're not very good at dealing with that stuff, no matter how many anti-oppression workshops we do. And there's often some sense of urgency that privileges the immediate and makes it harder to have those conversations. So one thing I've been thinking a lot about is how blockades or occupations can also shut down those relations and open up new ways of experimenting with interacting with each other.
We never were able to really well organize, like, let's say, a welcoming committee. And I think that with a welcoming committee, we would have been able to, like, okay, somebody's coming in, like, it's important that, like, right away we engage with them, we talk with them. And then also, then we kind of, like, can explain, like, a little bit about 101 about what's going on here. And that never happened. People kind of were flowing into the camp, like, free form, going. There was no attempting to interact with people, like, right when they came into the camp. And that would have done a number of things. Like, one thing, it would have camped the camp a little bit more secure, so that there was, like, somebody who knew, like, who's coming in and out of camp. Because a lot of times, like infiltrators and alt-right people and stuff like that, if they came into the camp and somebody like right away engaged with them, then that would have actually deterred them from going farther, because I don't think that they would probably want to walk around and look around and maybe agitate and then walk away. Whereas somebody directly confronted them, tried to like interact with them, meaning like have a conversation with them and introduce them to the space. A lot of times just that amount of attention will deter people. The other thing that it would have done was that it would have like given people who like, you know, maybe are supportive or like are looking for like a place to stay dry or like anything like that, to understand like, hey, listen, like this is an illegal occupation. This is not necessarily, and in my opinion, not a safer place to be than in a lot of other places in the city, due to the fact of like the higher police presence and the possibility of like a raid at any point in time and the higher surveillance. And explaining to people like, hey, this is a space like we don't allow misogyny, we don't allow transphobia, like we don't allow racism, we don't allow sexism, like all of these things, and giving like a moment to have that conversation with somebody. And what that does is it allows them a chance, like gives them the opportunity to interact with the space in a way that A, isn't like harming or hurting other people, and B, allows them to actually feel a part of what's going on, rather than when somebody is coming in who is new to these things, only having like the shaming component, just having call out culture. I think that wasn't an ideal situation for the camp. I think that people pushed back really hard against like a lot of different forms of organization at the camp. I'm not an anti-organizationalist per se. What I think that happens, especially in these spaces, is that if we don't organize ourselves effectively, anti-hierarchically, then all of like the social problems that we try and deal with like sexism, racism, transphobia, all these things, then all they do is, unless we create like an organization to try and like facilitate and maintain that culture, then the fucked up culture that's outside of our camp is just going to recreate itself within the camp. And that's kind of what happened on a number of different levels.
From the folks we interviewed, there seemed to be a few key areas where better communication could have prevented unnecessary tensions.
One of the core splits was between those who wanted to issue demands and who felt the blockaders needed to present a unified front and agree on one clear message, and those who preferred to act autonomously, either alone or with a few comrades they shared affinity with.
This is a really common division. While it didn't prevent this group from pulling off an incredible occupation, it did cause some hard feelings and confusion.
One possibility for the future would be to have clear conversations about how autonomy and organization don't have to conflict. Many comrades came away from this action believing that those who didn't want to sign on to demands or points of unity were actively blocking the others from organizing the infrastructure they wanted to see, like a welcoming committee or a media team. This tension was exacerbated by communiques on both sides not clearly representing just the authors who wrote them, but claiming to speak for the entire group.
Okay, I have to say it. Fuck demands. I mean, why ask anything from those in power when our goal is to redistribute power? And there will always be people who want to work within existing power structures. How important is it to try to appease them?
Yeah, I hear you, but this isn't as much about giving in to ideologies you don't share. It's about building capacity across ideology, which is critically important right now. We don't all have to agree, but we all benefit from establishing good relationships with other anarchists and anti-hierarchical organizers. For example, if points of unity were so important to some, those blockaders who wanted to could have signed on to a statement that expressed shared values, as long as they weren't phrased as demands. Something like, "We agree that this is a space that doesn't tolerate oppression." And it probably would have been a good idea to be more intentional about how to welcome people into the space, so as to set people up for success and help everyone feel responsible for shutting down oppressive behavior when it happened.
That all makes sense, but my concern is how quickly this can devolve into controlling behavior, where a few in camp put a lot of pressure on the rest to sign on to their vision of how things should go. What's more inspiring to me is when a highly diverse group can come together for different reasons using different tactics, and still pull off something incredible. It's worth considering that the most exciting things that came out of this action all happened autonomously, without a committee to approve of or direct them.
Right. There was clearly at least one blockader who believed everyone should push harder, not just to block the train, but to disrupt and eventually take over the entire port, essentially syndicalizing it. Clearly, this wasn't what everyone else was there to do. But in the model I'm proposing, we can all maintain our autonomy and our different goals. I'm just pointing out that anarchists who already believe in autonomy as a core value would do well to explain that to others, those who are more interested in social unity and consensus, how they can exercise their own autonomy. Some unity-oriented comrades feel blocked from acting if they can't get everyone else to sign on, and resent actions that they think represent the whole group.
So it seems like one core lesson for any public occupation is that you can't force unity, but you can work towards more transparent and welcoming spaces. I do think making our spaces friendly is important and doesn't have to come at the cost of sacrificing autonomy.
Like, just being friendly as you remind people that they're free to act in the ways they want to, and we're going to do the same.
This seems like a no-brainer, but being open and warm to people as you explain your differences helps create the kind of social coherence that will actually feel good to everyone. That isn't coercive.
Right, and different circumstances will call for different social responses, clearly. Tensions always run high when everyone's waiting for a raid and running on lots of coffee and very little sleep. So having these conversations as part of the fun times in camp will help them go better than if everyone's urgently barking at each other at a general assembly.
So one conversation that could have happened early on would be something like, organizing a media team would be rad, go ahead and do it. Of course, many people will be creating media without coordination, but those who want to coordinate are free to do so.
Exactly. And if that wasn't well received, following up with why you personally aren't interested in having a unified voice come out of the blockade and don't really care what the mainstream media is printing.
Some comrades did seem really concerned about the image presented to the so-called general public.
And I think it's, again, just most important to be aware of everything you do and how it could affect the optics and the response from the community. A lot of that support came from people not so radical ideologies and tendencies, and people who you don't tend to see organizing in Olympia in the streets. And I think that's really important to consider when doing actions like this, is like the way we present ourselves to the community ends up being really important. Like, I've heard from various people calling themselves anarchists, whatever that means, that like the general public hates us. The general public doesn't want anything to do with us. Like, no matter what we do, it's not really going to change. It's like the same sort of rhetoric that you hear for the mainstream media, which is a lot more accurate, I think. Like, the mainstream media is always going to spin things for corporate gain. That's what they do. But the greater public is like a really diverse group of people, and I think the friendlier of an environment that we can create, the more support we ended up getting, and I think that showed itself in this action.
But others were less anxious about crafting a good story for the media and appreciated the diverse communiques coming out of the blockade.
I think there was a lot of really solid media coverage from movement media, so It's Going Down and Crime Think. I saw a lot of good articles and texts come out of the blockade itself that people wrote themselves, and I thought that was a great way for people to communicate their different positions and different ideas without needing a unified voice. I didn't actually see that much mainstream media. There was a pretty solid Washington Post article that came out, unfortunately, the morning the camp was evicted. I think the title was something like, "Anti-fracking protesters block train in Olympia and they have no plans to leave." We unfortunately left literally as the article was published. And I think that if the camp had continued past that point for a few more days, I think there would have been a lot more attention drawn to it, which could have been good or bad.
The news was very much like curious about what was going on this year and was kind of like ready for the bloodshed. There was kind of this funny time one night where like these Cairo, which is the local news station, had contacted protester and said like, hey, like we want to go down and interview somebody. And they said like, okay, cool. I'm not there. You go down there and I'll like call somebody to come and talk to you. So that they show up. And I think that they've learned from like Mayday and stuff like that, that like, they can't really show up with their Cairo van because people don't take too kindly to that. And so they showed up in like an unmarked white van with stuff on the top. And so everybody's thinking that it's some type of surveillance van. And so they call this person who's not there, to say like, okay, we're here. There's people in masks starting to like walk over to the van and they're throwing rocks at the van. And they're like, and then the protester who contacted them had given them a fake name. They're like leaning out the window, be like, Riley sent us. And of course, like nobody knows who the fuck Riley is, And so, but it was funny because, then the scouts essentially started following around this van, which was the Cairo van, but people, obviously were very suspicious and they're like, the so-called Cairo van has now moved over to 4th and whatever, And it was just hilarious. When Cairo eventually did get to interview somebody and then they videotaped the blockade from very far away, we were having a dance night there. And people were all blocked up and dancing around with black flags, and it was really awesome. And actually, considering like the Cairo coverage was not overly negative. It did not actually like say horrible things about the protesters. It didn't like. It was what I would say would be like neutral to benign, passive support coverage in the mainstream media, which was, or at least with Cairo, not with our local newspaper.
Our local paper is like fucking garbage, but we always knew that. Some weird shit with them where they basically were asserting that prop-ins are not being shipped, and in the way they wrote the article, it was like in this very vague, twisted language of being like, there is not current plans to move them, and then omitting the fact that there's bags of prop-ins in clear view in the port, even though in comments and stuff they were like, it doesn't say there's not prop-ins there, but it doesn't say that there are, and says that there's no plans to move them and that there hasn't been a delivery since like 2016, strongly implying that this is literally a fake thing, which is just ridiculous. So it's like hard not to get annoyed by all the shitty, stupid things that are going to be said about any action. In a lot of ways, that matters less and less, because I think that people who, in solidarity with our action and going to be inspired by the blockade, are looking other places. I know that there are other perspectives that would desire like there to be a unified message, but I think that showing others that there's a myriad of reasons to be blockading a train, and also that it is possible for people whose like affinity might begin and end with really not wanting this train to pass, to be able to like work together, and not only like work together and tolerate each other, but like foster a really beautiful space and life together, while also like having like flourishing and like complex disagreements that are not just two sides but many, many faceted. And I think that sharing that and like having many different perspectives shared is a huge positive.
The Olympia blockade has as many different stories as people who built it, moved through it, and made things happen there. You can find links to some of these in our show notes. Parts of it were really messy. Parts of it exposed social tensions that we'll have to learn better ways of handling over the coming years, not only between different tendencies, but between white and indigenous organizers, cis and trans people, and all the other axes of structural oppression that we as individuals bring with us into spaces like this. What is most heartening about actions like these is that people keep showing up and keep trying to work together, despite these inevitable clashes.
And even those who disagreed and experienced tension are still in communication with each other months after the blockade ended. The relationships forged through this action continue to grow and transform.
Meanwhile, there's a commune-sized hole in the hearts of the blockaders who shared that space for 12 days.
We struck a huge blow. It fills me with joy and sorrow constantly in these few days after we've gotten broken up. about, what happened, what we did, the fact that they tore it all down, new connections, new hopes. Yeah.
So the entire thing feels pretty repeatable to me. We did repeat it, and I suspect we'll repeat it again, but hopefully not in November. Hopefully sometime with sun, like July. That'd be nice. I think that the things we learned last year really manifested themselves this year, and I hope that the same thing happens in the future. I hope the relationships and capacities and skills we are continuing to gain grow and spread rather than withering and dying.
We opened up somewhat of a magical portal into kind of another dimension that, while being supported by capitalism surrounding it, was not so capitalist and gave a lot of people an idea of what different systems could look like. And it was also about creating autonomous community. And I think we opened up a space for the community at large in this area to start having bigger discussions.
In closing, we'll leave you with the gratitude One Rebel offers to the Indigenous comrades who participated in and helped support the blockade.
Yeah, I want to acknowledge that we're on stolen Squaxin and Nisqually land, governed by the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, and I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're occupying space, that we are already on occupied land, and then also specifically when talking about fossil fuel infrastructure, that Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of both resistance to fossil fuels and also the negative impacts that are had by fossil fuel infrastructure and the environmental devastation that results. And I'd like to also thank Nisqually tribal members and other Indigenous folks from nearby tribes who did come to the blockade and did a lot of work, both there and then also other prayer work and ceremony work that I think was really important for the blockade's success, and also for us, for people who were there all the time to feel like we could keep going.
Move back. Move back.
That's our show for today. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the streets. Our weekly news show, The Hot Wire, will be back with its second season starting in February. Subscribe by searching for The Ex-Worker on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thanks to Underground Reverie for the music. The Crime Think Ex-Worker podcast is part of the Channel Zero network. To listen to a 24/7 stream of anarchist podcasts, go to channelzeronetwork.com and check out a trailer for one of the other podcasts in the network now.
Radical Underground is a podcast that connects underground music with radical politics from around the world. So if you like anarchy and good music about kicking fascists in the face, check us out on Channel Zero, SoundCloud, iTunes, and anywhere else you can find us.
Sick of your right-wing bullshit, it's a fucking disgrace. So let the finger push right in.